Just a temp. That's what the personnel manager said when she processed Rachel Torres through the system at Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah. 2 weeks. Maximum. No benefits. No questions. The kind of assignment designed for people who needed to disappear into routine and stay invisible. Rachel didn't argue. She'd learned years ago that silence was a survival tactic more reliable than any weapon. The pediatric floor smelled like hand sanitizer and artificial vanilla, the hospital's futile attempt to mask the sharper scents underneath. Antiseptic. Fear. The particular metallic tang of a child's tears. Rachel moved through the corridors at 6:27 a.m. on her first shift, her temp badge clipped to pale blue scrubs that fit like borrowed skin. The badge itself was a temporary thing, like everything else about her current existence. The name on it was real. The history behind it was not. Not officially. The fluorescent lights above hummed their constant, nerve-grinding frequency. She'd forgotten how much she hated that sound, like 10,000 dying insects. Her hands moved on their own as she walked, fingers already reaching for the clipboard at each station, already reading, already assessing. Muscle memory. 14 years of it. For years of peacetime. 10 before that in places where peace was only something that happened after you stopped bleeding. Room 347 was at the end of the east corridor, the third door past the medication station. Rachel didn't plan to look at that room specifically. It just happened that way. The charge nurse, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and varicose veins showing through her compression stockings, handed her a patient list and said, "Start with these 4, and whatever you do, don't let Dr. Sterling see you doing it wrong. He's having a mood." Patricia lowered her voice on the last part, like mood was code for something worse. Rachel nodded. She took the clipboard. The first patient was a 6-year-old with asthma. Second was a 9-year-old post-appendectomy. Third was an 11-year-old with acute leukemia, already 3 months into remission protocol. Rachel moved through their rooms with the kind of efficiency that came from having once triaged 40 patients in a field hospital with no running water and nothing for pain except tetracaine and prayer. These rooms had monitors. For pumps with alarms. A call button that actually worked. These rooms were luxuries she'd learned never to take for granted. The fourth chart in her hand made her pause at the nurse's station. Room 347. Patient, James Mitchell. Age 8, diagnosis, progressive motor neuropathy, stage 3. Specialists consulted, 12. Last specialist note, no further interventions recommended. Prognosis, irreversible decline. The handwriting on that last note was neat and final, the kind of penmanship that belonged to someone who'd already decided a child's future before that child had learned multiplication tables. Rachel felt something shift in her chest, a small tectonic movement of memory. James Mitchell. That last name wasn't unusual. But when she flipped to the emergency contact information, her hands went very still. Primary contact, General James C. Mitchell, United States Marine Corps. Retired. The chart felt suddenly heavier. She was still holding it like that, frozen at the nurse's station, eyes locked on those letters, when she heard the shoes. Polished Italian leather. Colhon, probably. The kind of shoes that cost more than her entire rent. They clicked across the tile floor with a rhythm that belonged to someone accustomed to having corridors part for him. Dr. Marcus Sterling was tall, with the kind of jawline that looked like it had been carved from administrative privilege and private school connections. His tie was silk. His watch was a Rolex. His expression, as he moved past the medication station toward the doctor's lounge, was the expression of a man who'd never once considered that anyone in this hospital might be worth his attention. Except he stopped. Just for a moment. Just long enough to glance sideways at Rachel, still holding the chart for room 347. His eyes, pale blue, the color of winter sky over concrete, moved across her face like she was an equation he'd suddenly decided to solve. Then he kept walking. The shoes clicked. The door to the doctor's lounge closed. Rachel exhaled without knowing she'd been holding her breath. What she didn't know was What she couldn't have known, standing there with a borrowed badge and 14 years of erased history, was that Dr. Sterling had spent the last 6 months building something intricate and profitable. The kind of arrangement that required silence from staff who noticed patterns. The kind of scheme that needed people to look the other way when medication costs for the pediatric ward started climbing by 30, 40, sometimes 50%. Kickbacks from a pharmaceutical supplier in Jacksonville. Phantom prescriptions for drugs that never left the stockroom. Invoices padded so carefully that the auditing system had stopped noticing them at all. And he'd just watched Rachel Torres log into the electronic charting system with her meticulous handwriting and her careful attention to detail and her tendency to follow every protocol exactly the way it was written. Her kind of care created a paper trail. Her kind of competence was dangerous. She didn't notice any of this, of course. She was already moving toward room 347, chart in hand, her mind working through the clinical picture. Progressive motor neuropathy at stage 3 in an 8-year-old meant deteriorating control of voluntary muscles. Weakness starting in the extremities, likely progressing toward respiratory and cardiac involvement. 12 specialists had documented the decline. 12 had essentially written the child's medical obituary and filed it away. The boy was sitting up in bed when she entered, his small frame thin enough that she could count the ribs beneath his hospital gown. His eyes were awake though, alert, intelligent, tracking her movement as she crossed the room. The fur in his left arm was running saline, nothing else. No drips. No medications beyond basic electrolyte balance. The chart notes were sparse, vital signs stable, pain manageable, diet as tolerated. "Hi there," Rachel said quietly. "I'm Rachel. I'm going to be helping take care of you today. How are you feeling?" The boy's voice came out smaller than his intelligence looked, weakened but clear. "Okay. My legs don't work as good anymore." He said it the way children say factual things about their lives, without the despair that older people carried into the same statement. "I see that in your chart," Rachel said. She was already assessing the room, the muscle tone in his shoulders, the way he held his head, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested lower motor neuron involvement more than upper. The progression pattern was textbook. The prognosis was brutal. And the name on the chart meant this boy's father had once stood in front of her unit at Camp Lejeune and issued orders that she'd carried into places where people didn't come back the same. If they came back at all. She didn't let that land in her face. She never did. Her expression stayed neutral, her voice steady, her hands as she checked his vitals, pulse, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, moving with the kind of clinical precision that came from having done it thousands of times before. "My dad visits on weekends," the boy said. "He's usually busy though. He's a general." Rachel's hands continued moving. Professional. Measured. The trembling that existed somewhere deep in her chest didn't surface. 13 years of training in exactly this, compartmentalize. Survival. The ability to stand in front of a superior officer who'd ordered you into an operation that went catastrophically wrong, and smile, and salute, and say nothing. The ability to carry a secret so heavy it should have collapsed her spine, but she'd learned to distribute the weight across decades instead of days. "That's impressive," she said to the boy. "Generals have important work." She finished the vitals. She recorded them. She noted the subtle changes in his muscle tone that the last specialist had probably documented in the same clinical, defeated language. And she left the room with a promise to check on him again in 2 hours, and she did not allow herself to think about General James C. Mitchell or the Sangin Valley or the operation that didn't exist in any official record because the military had burned it so thoroughly that even the ashes left no residue. The hallway outside room 347 was empty except for the fluorescent hum. She stood there for exactly 3 seconds, breathing through her nose, letting the institutional smell of the hospital, the antiseptic and the hand sanitizer and the faint underneath scent of someone's spilled coffee, ground her back to the present moment. Her hands had stopped shaking by the time she walked back to the nurse's station. Patricia looked up from her computer. "How's the kid in 347? Rough case, that one. Parents are nice though. Really nice. The dad's military. You can tell, has that way about him. Rachel didn't respond directly. She clipped the chart back into place and pulled the next one. I'll monitor him. Any specific concerns I should note? Just watch for any changes in his respiratory status, Patricia said. Kid's declining but he's stable. For now. The father's been talking to everyone, different specialists, second opinions, that kind of thing. You know how it is. Parents don't want to accept the diagnosis. Rachel nodded. She did know. She'd seen parents make choices born from desperation. She'd seen what happened when hope collided with prognosis and nobody won. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't know for another 7 hours, when Dr. Sterling made his first phone call, was that her meticulous attention to detail was already making him consider his next move. She was the kind of nurse who read every note. Who questioned inconsistencies. Who documented what she saw instead of what she was supposed to see. That kind of integrity was incompatible with a scheme that required blindness from everyone around him. He was already calculating how to neutralize the threat. But first, he needed to understand her better. He needed to see how she'd respond to pressure. He needed to confirm his suspicion that this quiet, competent woman with the downcast eyes was going to be a problem. The day moved forward. The fluorescent lights hummed. Children called for their mothers. Monitors beeped their constant litany of reassurance or alarm. And Rachel Torres, Senior Chief Petty Officer, officially deceased in every military database that mattered, charted medications and checked vital signs and kept her history locked so deep inside that no one, not Patricia, not the charge nurse, not even the general himself if he'd walked past her in the corridor, would have seen anything except what she wanted them to see, the temporary nurse, competent but unremarkable, invisible. But invisibility had its cost. And in room 347, a child with deteriorating muscles and a family name that meant everything was wasting away while 12 specialists had already written his ending. She'd read that chart now. She'd met the boy. And somewhere in the clinical distance she'd perfected over 14 years of survival, something had cracked. The hiss of a blood pressure cuff deflating. The beep of a monitor finding sinus rhythm. The whisper of a child's voice saying his father was usually busy but he was a general. These sounds would matter more than she could possibly know. But that realization was still 5 segments away, and for now, Rachel Torres kept moving through the pediatric floor, a ghost in borrowed scrubs, waiting for the moment when her cover started to show cracks. The cafeteria at Oak Creek Memorial smelled like industrial disinfectant trying to mask something older, burnt coffee, stale milk, the faint metallic tang of blood that never quite washed out of the tile grout. Rachel carried her tray to a corner table, the kind where you could see who was coming and where all the exits were. Old habits. The kind of habits that kept you breathing in places where breathing wasn't guaranteed. She'd been at Oak Creek for 4 days. 112 hours of charting with precision, of catching medication errors before they reached patients, of moving through the pediatric floor like a ghost in borrowed scrubs. Her temp badge clipped to her pocket felt like a target. Everything felt like a target when you were erased from official records, when the Pentagon had filed you under classified operation, Sangin Valley, do not pursue. Dr. Sterling walked into the cafeteria with 2 residents trailing behind him like pilot fish. He was the kind of man whose voice arrived before his body did, all confidence and entitlement, the sound of someone who'd never been told no in any way that stuck. He was tall, early 50s, the type who wore his $5,000 watch like a weapon. His eyes moved across the room and found Rachel immediately. "Gentlemen," he said, loud enough that the entire west side of the cafeteria turned to listen. "I'll give this one 3 days. Maximum a week. These temp nurses never last." He settled into a seat 6 tables away, angled so she could hear every word. The ones without real credentials, without institutional loyalty, they crack under pressure. Watch her face when things get difficult. The fear shows. The residents laughed nervously, the kind of laughter that happened because their supervisor had already decided something was funny. Rachel continued eating her sandwich. Her hand was steady. Her breathing was controlled. The flush creeping up her neck was nothing, just blood moving through capillaries, a physical response she could observe without judgment the way she'd learned to observe pain in field hospitals. Pain was data. Humiliation was the same. Data could be processed. Data didn't matter. But she felt Michael in room 347, down the hallway. She'd spent her break with him that morning, watching him struggle through respiratory exercises that tired him out more than they helped. 8 years old. The general's son. She'd read his chart 3 times. Every specialist had written the same conclusion: progressive decline, symptom management, comfort care. Prepare the family for the inevitable. She wondered if Sterling had ever sat in a room with a child learning how to die. She wondered if he'd even entered a patient's room without already knowing what he was going to bill insurance for. That afternoon, Sterling found her in the cafeteria again. This time she was eating alone, a sandwich and some fruit, reviewing Michael's patient notes between bites. The break room was full. The cafeteria was the only place where she could think. She didn't see him coming until the movement registered, a presence at her table, the smell of expensive cologne mixing with the antiseptic reek of the hospital, a deliberate shift in air pressure. Sterling was setting his tray down beside hers when he made the move. Not aggressive. Too calculated for that. His elbow caught her tray on what looked like an accident, and if anyone had been watching closely enough, they might have noticed the precise angle of his arm, the way his weight shifted forward at exactly the right moment. Coffee spilled across her scrubs. The fruit cup scattered across the floor, blueberries rolling under adjacent tables like they were fleeing. Her sandwich fell face down on the tile. The plastic tray clattered end over end, the sound sharp and bright in the sudden silence that came when 30 staff members stopped chewing and turned to watch. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Sterling said. He didn't apologize. He didn't offer a napkin. He just smiled, that predator's smile, and walked away carrying his untouched lunch. Rachel stood slowly. Coffee dripped from her collar, soaking into the fabric of her scrubs. She could feel every eye in the cafeteria on her, waiting for the response. Waiting for the crack Sterling had predicted. 1 week maximum. Watch her face when things get difficult. The fear shows. She bent and began gathering the mess. Blueberries. Plastic pieces. The ruined sandwich. A resident she'd worked with on the afternoon shift stood up, started to help, and she waved him off with a small shake of her head. Not unkind. Just clear. She didn't need rescue. She'd cleaned worse things off worse floors than this cafeteria tile, and she wasn't about to start accepting pity now. By the next morning, Sterling had moved to Act 3 of his calculated destruction. He was at the nurse's station when she arrived for her shift, patient chart in hand, his voice carrying that same polished edge. The midnight labs on the patient in 347 were ordered incorrectly, he announced, loud enough for the floor to hear. Whoever processed those charts clearly isn't reading orders carefully enough. Basic competence, people. That's all we're asking for. Rachel was walking past with Michael's morning medications. She didn't break stride. Her hands remained steady as she set the 4 bags on the supply cart. 60 milligrams of lorazepam for the boy's pain episodes. 200 units of vitamin D, every specialist had missed that his levels were critical. Things that didn't add up unless you knew what you were looking for. Unless you treated chemical exposure in field hospitals where the symptoms looked exactly like degenerative nerve disease, but the treatment protocols existed if anyone bothered to look deeper than manage symptoms, make him comfortable. Sterling saw her charting an hour later. He came directly to the break room, where she was documenting Michael's morning assessment with the kind of meticulous detail that was becoming a problem for him. A problem for his kickback arrangement with the pharmaceutical supplier, the one that inflated pediatric medication costs across the entire hospital system. Charting like Rachel's was the kind that got audited. The kind that raised questions. "My office," he said. Not a request. Now. She followed him down the hallway, past the fluorescent lights humming their mechanical song. His office was all glass and stainless steel, a view of downtown Savannah from the 16th floor. The kind of office that told you everything about a man, that he cared about views and power symbols more than the people he was supposed to heal. "We've had reports of missing medications from the pediatric unit," he said, settling into his chair like a judge. "Controlled substances, specifically midazolam. Fentanyl. As the newest staff member, you understand we need to investigate." The accusation landed like a stone. False. Provable as false if anyone bothered to check the drug log she'd been meticulously documenting. But that was the point, wasn't it? The check would take time. She'd be under scrutiny. Questions would be asked. Her temp status made her vulnerable in ways that permanent staff weren't. Rachel said nothing. Defending herself meant explaining her background. It meant pulling at threads that were supposed to stay buried. The gag order in her file didn't have an expiration date. The operation in Sangin didn't officially exist. And if she surfaced now, if she started digging into her own record to prove Sterling was lying, she'd have questions to answer, from the Pentagon, from Naval Criminal Investigative Service, from people who'd signed off on her erasure in the first place. So she accepted the accusation without comment. She passed the investigation without comment. She returned to the pediatric floor without comment and continued moving through her shifts like a ghost in borrowed scrubs, absorbing Sterling's escalating campaign of strategic humiliation. He reassigned her to night shifts where oversight was minimal. He pulled her from patients who were improving too quickly, patients whose charts might attract attention. He scheduled her for the worst call combinations, the shifts that guaranteed exhaustion. He questioned every decision she made in front of other staff. "Is that the right protocol, Rachel? You might want to double-check your credentials on that one." Small things. Paper cuts of psychological warfare. The kind of attack that left no visible damage but accumulated like poison. And Rachel continued working. She sat with Michael during her breaks, watching him do his respiratory exercises, listening to him talk about his father, the general who visited when command duties allowed, which was never often enough. The boy had his father's eyes, that same stone-grey color. He asked Rachel about her own family, and she told him stories that were true but belonged to someone else, stories from before Sangin, from before the operation that broke something in the classification system itself. Late one night, alone in the break room, Rachel pulled Michael's chart and began cross-referencing his symptoms with literature she wasn't supposed to have access to anymore. Her medical training from the field hospitals in Helmand Province came back like muscle memory. The respiratory issues. The progressive weakness. The neuropathic pain that didn't respond to standard treatment. It didn't match simple degenerative disease. It matched organophosphate poisoning, chemical exposure with delayed symptoms. She'd seen it in Sangin. She'd treated it there. And the treatment protocols existed, but they required someone with authority to suggest them, to push back against the specialists who'd already written their conclusions and moved on. She couldn't do that as a temp nurse. She could barely exist as a temp nurse. The next morning, Michael's numbers were declining. His O2 sat dropping. His respiratory rate climbing. By noon, the attending called for more aggressive management. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the morning routine examination had become something else entirely. Rachel was checking his vitals when his breathing changed, that sound, the one that meant the airways were compromising, that something catastrophic was shifting in his chest. The room went dead silent. She reached for the emergency call button, and that was when Michael's monitors began screaming. The monitor alarm screamed through room 347 like a medevac siren cutting through a Sangin Valley dawn. Michael's oxygen saturation plummeted across the screen, 90%, 85, 78, each number a step toward arrest. His small lips turned blue. The attending physician, Dr. Patterson, stood frozen beside the bed, his hand reaching for the emergency call button but stopping short, as if the motion itself might shatter something fragile. Rachel was passing the hallway with a med cart when she heard it. That particular alarm. The one that meant a child's airway was closing and time had become a countdown. She knew the sound like she knew the hiss of diesel engines and the whump of rotor blades. 3 years in Sangin had taught her that hesitation was the first step toward a body bag. She was through the door in 3 strides. Michael lay in the pediatric bed, his small chest heaving against invisible weight, his eyes wide with the primal terror of a child who couldn't breathe. His skin had taken on the waxy quality of dropping oxygen, not yet grey, but heading there. The monitor was screaming at a heart rate of 134, climbing toward cardiac arrest. The trachea deviation was visible now if you knew to look, a subtle shift in the child's neck anatomy that most nurses would miss. But Rachel wasn't most nurses. "Tension pneumothorax," she said, moving to the crash cart with the efficient grace of someone who had performed this procedure in far worse conditions than an air-conditioned pediatric ward. Her hands were already moving toward the chest tube kit, fingers selecting equipment with absolute certainty. Air's collapsing his lung and compressing his heart. "We need immediate needle decompression." Dr. Patterson blinked. "We need to wait for the pulmonologist. We can't just, he's only 8 years old. We need proper protocol." Michael's saturation hit 70%. Rachel didn't answer. Answers were for moments when children weren't dying. She'd learned that lesson in a field hospital 40 kilometers from Sangin, where a young Marine Lance Corporal had coded because someone was waiting for the right specialist instead of trusting their hands. That Marine had a mother somewhere in North Carolina who'd spent 18 years wondering what her son looked like at 25. She found the second intercostal space, midclavicular line. The anatomical landmarks were the same in a child as they were in the blast victim she'd pulled from rubble, just smaller, requiring less space, less angle, less force. She prepped the site with antiseptic that smelled like every emergency room she'd ever known, that sharp chemical bite that meant someone's life was about to change direction. For seconds. 5. The 14-gauge needle was smooth and cold against her fingertips. What happened next took 40 seconds. Perhaps less. Her hands moved with a precision that belonged in an operating theater at Naval Hospital Bagram, not a pediatric ward at Oak Creek Memorial in Savannah. The needle entered at the exact angle, perpendicular to the chest wall, aimed above the rib to avoid the neurovascular bundle. No hesitation. No tremor. The kind of steady that comes from having done the same motion on 37 different patients, in darkness, under fire, while trying to keep hope alive in places where hope was a dangerous commodity. The needle advanced, reached the pleural space, and released the trapped air with an audible hiss like a breath being returned to the world. Michael's saturation began climbing immediately. 72. 80. 91. His color shifted back toward human. His breathing became something less like drowning. The heart rate began its descent from the edge of fibrillation. The monitor screaming settled into the steady beep of a child coming back from the precipice. The whole procedure took 40 seconds. Dr. Sterling stood in the doorway, having arrived at the sound of the code alarm. He'd moved with practiced casualness, the way hospital administrators do when they're responding to crisis without committing to emergency. He watched the entire thing. His face remained unreadable, the professional composure of a man who'd spent a decade learning to show nothing while calculating everything. But his mind was racing. No temp nurse had training like that. No temporary contract pediatric aide possessed the anatomical knowledge, the equipment familiarity, the muscle memory that came from emergency medicine at the highest level. That level belonged to trauma surgeons, field hospital personnel, military medicine. His pulse quickened with the certainty that something was very wrong with Rachel Torres's employment file. She was either a liability or a threat. Either way, she needed to go before she started asking questions about Michael's medication costs, before she might notice that his prescribed medications were triple what pediatric standards demanded, before her competence exposed the entire kickback arrangement he'd built with Meridian Pharmaceuticals. Sterling had structured the scheme carefully, slightly inflated dosages, coded as pediatric complications requiring advanced pharmaceutical management, then billed to insurance at premium rates. The kickbacks came back through consulting fees, research grants, speaker honorariums. Untraceable. Legal on paper. Profitable by several $100,000 a year. Rachel Torres threatened that entire income stream. She was stepping back from the bed now, removing her gloves with the practiced economy of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. Michael was breathing normally, his oxygen saturation holding at 94%, his small hand gripping the bed rail. She reached over and steadied his shoulder. "You're okay," she said quietly. "You're going to be okay." Not a promise. A statement of fact. The kind of certainty that children believe because it comes from someone whose hands have already proven they know what they're doing. Dr. Patterson was staring at her like she'd just performed resurrection in a pediatric ward. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice still carrying the tremor of someone pulled back from complete helplessness. "That it was a pneumothorax? That specific?" "We would have ordered imaging, called the pulmonologist, and by then." "I've seen this presentation before," Rachel said simply, disposing of the needle with the care it deserved. Not a lie. Not quite the whole truth. The deviation, the saturation drop, the speed of decompensation. It matches a specific pattern. What she didn't say, I saw it in Sangin. I saw it in 37 different chests. I learned to recognize it before imaging confirmed it because children don't have time for certainty in combat medicine. I learned to trust my hands because my hands were all that stood between breathing and not breathing. I learned to move because hesitation is another word for death. Sterling turned and walked back down the corridor before she could look toward the doorway. His phone was already in his hand. He had calls to make. A network to activate. The chairman of the hospital board was probably still on the golf course at Savannah Golf Club, a membership Sterling had earned through the same careful arrangement of favors that had funded his 3 ex-wives' settlement payments. One call. That's all it would take. Rachel finished documenting Michael's vitals in the chart, her handwriting precise as surgical sutures. She could feel the weight of Dr. Sterling's departure like pressure in a sealed room. She knew, in the way that survival instinct taught her to know things, that something had shifted. That she had made a mistake, not in saving the child, but in showing too much of who she actually was. The quiet ones were always the most dangerous because when they moved, it meant everything. Michael's mother would arrive in visiting hours with flowers and a prayer of gratitude. She would squeeze Rachel's hand and call her a hero. She would have no idea that the boy in the bed was the son of a Marine general, that Rachel had served under that general's command in a valley where the rules of medicine bent under the weight of survival. She would never know that this small 8-year-old child represented a connection to a world that officially no longer existed, a past so classified that Rachel's own records had been erased from every system that mattered. But Dr. Sterling would know something was wrong. He would know that a temp nurse didn't have that kind of training. And he would move to protect what he'd built before Rachel could become a problem he couldn't manage. Within the hour, Sterling was on the phone with the chairman, his voice carrying the rehearsed concern of a doctor protecting patient safety. He mentioned medication discrepancies on Rachel's shifts. Possible theft. Inventory gaps that occurred only when she was working. He was professional. Worried. The kind of concern that made administrators nervous. By the time the afternoon shift ended, a corporate investigator was already pulling Rachel's background file, and Sterling's network was being activated like a script that had been practiced 100 times. Rachel sat in the break room at 4:19 p.m., eating a container of Jell-O from the cafeteria because it was the only thing that fit in her scrub pocket, when security appeared at the door. They weren't rough about it. They were never rough when the accused person came quietly. They were almost apologetic. She knew how to read the signs, the shift supervisor's nervousness, the security guard's hand position, the specific way hospital administrators looked at personnel they'd been told to remove immediately. Rachel Torres? The supervisor's voice had the careful neutrality of someone reading from a script that had already decided the ending. We need you to come with us. Your employment has been terminated effective immediately. There are some questions we need to discuss about controlled substance handling. She set down the Jell-O container. Didn't argue. Didn't defend herself. Because defense meant disclosure, and disclosure meant breaking the gag order that was the only thing keeping her from federal prison. There were no good moves on this board. There were only moves that kept her quiet and breathing. She stood, removed her temporary badge, and placed it on the table with the careful respect you give something that mattered, even if only for a moment. The rain started as they walked her to the security office, a soft Georgia rain that turned the asphalt dark as fresh blood. She thought about Michael upstairs, about his oxygen saturation climbing back toward normal, about the small relief of knowing he would breathe tomorrow. She thought about the general, about the unit she'd served under in a place where the rules were written in blood and survival. She thought about the combat boots in her locker at home, the pair she'd pulled off her own feet to give to a Marine Lance Corporal who'd lost his in the blast that took his leg. That Marine got home. Had a wife now. 3 kids. Last she'd heard, and how that information had come to her remained classified, he ran a prosthetics clinic in Portland. Sometimes that had to be enough. Sometimes saving someone had to be its own reward, even when it cost you everything. The security office smelled like burnt coffee and old complaints. The investigator was already setting up his laptop when she walked in, and Rachel understood with absolute clarity that this was stage 5. This was sabotage. This was Sterling moving to remove the threat before the threat could expose him. She had 48 hours before she would be sitting in a VA hospital waiting room in Augusta with a PTSD diagnosis and no medical license, surrounded by veterans she'd once treated in places that didn't exist anymore, clutching a pair of worn combat boots and wondering if saving lives mattered when your own life had become classified history. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she wasn't wrong about Michael's condition. She was going to be right about many other things, about the medication inflation, about the kickback scheme, about the corruption that ran through Oak Creek Memorial like an infection. She just wasn't going to be the one to expose it. And by then, it would be far too late to matter. Dr. Sterling's office occupied the corner of Oak Creek Memorial's administrative wing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Savannah River, mahogany desk the size of a surgical table. He sat behind it at 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday, Rachel's personnel file open in front of him, and reached for his phone. The hospital board chairman was mid-swing on the 18th hole at Forsyth Country Club when his phone buzzed. Sterling didn't apologize for the interruption. "We have a liability situation," Sterling said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. A temporary nurse on Pediatrics performed an invasive emergency procedure without attending authorization. Needle decompression on a minor. No supervision. If that child files a suit, we're looking at negligence and abandonment of protocol. The chairman stopped mid-backswing. Sterling could hear the golf course in the background, the distant murmur of other players, a cart motor humming. "She saved his life," the chairman said carefully. "That's not the point," Sterling replied. "The point is procedure. Liability. The point is that we have no idea what her credentials actually are. She's a temp. We don't know her background, her training, her certifications. She could be a licensed practical nurse pretending to be something more. We need her removed before the legal department has to explain why we let an unauthorized staff member perform trauma medicine on a pediatric patient." Silence stretched across the phone line. Sterling smiled. He could see the calculation happening on the other end, the potential lawsuit, the insurance deductible, the regulatory review. "I'll call HR," the chairman said finally. "Do it quietly," Sterling instructed. "And quickly." The second call came at 3:02 p.m. Rachel's temp agency answered on the third ring. Sterling identified himself, let the weight of his title hang in the air, and began talking about missed shifts, medication discrepancies, complaints from nursing staff. Nothing specific enough to dispute. Everything vague enough to be impossible to disprove. "We're concerned about her fit for the position," Sterling said smoothly. "She seems unable to follow protocol. The pediatric floor is high acuity. We need someone more reliable." The agency representative took notes. Sterling could hear the pen scratching. By the time he hung up, Rachel's placement was already flagged for review. The third call went to Marcus Wendell, a private investigator who had once helped Sterling bury a DEA inquiry into his pharmaceutical sourcing practices. The favor was old enough that Wendell owed him a name and an address and a willingness to look where he was pointed. Background check, Sterling said. Thorough one. I need anything that might disqualify her from clinical work. Arrests, financial problems, mental health issues, whatever exists. Won't take long, Wendell replied. I'll start with the usual databases. By 3:45 p.m., Rachel's temp agency called the pediatric nursing supervisor. The message was delivered with bureaucratic finality. The placement was being terminated effective immediately due to concerns about performance and credentialing. Could she please collect her belongings and clear the unit by end of shift? Rachel was in Michael's room when the supervisor found her, checking the boy's vitals, noting the improved oxygen saturation, the returning color to his small face. 2 hours earlier, this child had been dying. 2 hours earlier, her hands had moved through the precise choreography of emergency decompression, the needle angled at 45 degrees, the second intercostal space, the midclavicular line, the hiss of air escaping like a terrible, necessary breath. Now Michael sat propped against pillows, drawing pictures. A stick figure nurse. A stick figure boy. A stick figure in combat boots labeled Phantom. Rachel's chest tightened. The supervisor's voice was apologetic but immovable. Rachel listened without interrupting, her face revealing nothing. The agency had concerns. The hospital's liability team wanted her removed. She was to collect her personal items and leave the building within the hour. Rachel nodded. Said nothing. Did not argue. If she argued, she would have to explain. To explain meant speaking her name aloud in an official capacity. It meant creating a paper trail. It meant shattering the gag order that had been imposed 5 years ago in a classified debrief room, a military attorney explaining that Operation Sandcastle would never be officially acknowledged, that the 18 Marines killed in Sangin would be listed as killed in action under different circumstances, that the extraction operation that went catastrophically wrong would remain classified, and that she would speak of it to no one, ever, under penalty of federal prosecution. So Rachel collected her locker. She took the change of clothes she kept there. She took the photograph taped inside the door, a surgical team in front of a field hospital, wearing scrubs and exhaustion and the peculiar intimacy of people who had held each other's lives in their hands. And she took the combat boots. She'd worn them in Sangin. They'd carried her through 3 years of surgical triage, through the compound raid where Commander Price's entire squad came back alive because she'd managed a bleeding rate that should have been unsurvivable, through the mortar attack where she'd stabilized a Marine corporal's compound fracture and prepared him for evacuation while the ground shook. On her last day in theater, she'd pulled those boots off her own feet for a young Marine named Harrison who'd lost his in an IED blast. She'd carried him 300 meters to the extraction point in her socks, his blood mixing with sweat and dust, and handed him to the flight medic with the same calm she'd been practicing for 36 months. That Marine had survived. He'd gone home to Kansas. Rachel had received his address from mutual friends, had sent a single letter thanking him for his service, and had never heard back. It was enough. Now she held those boots, leather worn smooth at the heel, laces permanently stained, smell of desert dust and time. She walked to the pediatric floor exit. Security was already waiting, a young guard who looked uncomfortable with his assignment, probably because he was escorting a woman in hospital scrubs with tears streaming silently down her face and her hands shaking so hard she could barely carry the small box of her belongings. Michael watched from his doorway as she passed. His small voice called out, "Miss Rachel? Where are you going?" She stopped. Turned. Met his eyes. Did not look at Sterling, who stood framed in the hallway window of his office, watching her leave with visible satisfaction. "I have to go help other people now," Rachel told the boy, her voice steady even though her hands would not stop trembling. "But you're going to be okay. You're strong. You're braver than most people I know. Will you come back?" Michael asked. "No," Rachel said. Because the truth was cleaner than a lie. "But I'll remember you." Security walked her to the parking lot. Evening was falling across Savannah like grey water. The city lights were beginning to flicker on across the river. Rachel sat in her car for 40 minutes without starting the engine, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her nails left crescents in her palms, the combat boot sitting on the passenger seat like evidence of a life that no longer existed. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of rental apartments in unfamiliar neighborhoods, 2 weeks of eating food that tasted like nothing, 2 weeks of waking at 2 in the morning with her heart rate elevated and her breath shallow, convinced that she was back in Sangin, convinced that the mortar attack was starting again. At 3 weeks, she drove north to Augusta, to the Veterans Affairs Medical Center, and sat in a waiting room surrounded by men in various states of visible and invisible collapse. A Marine corporal missing his left leg sat across from her. She recognized him. His name was Patterson. She'd applied a tourniquet to his leg in 2011 and told him jokes about his terrible tattoo to keep him conscious during transport. Patterson recognized her too. His eyes widened. He started to speak. Rachel shook her head slightly. Just a small movement. A single gesture asking for silence. Patterson's jaw tightened. He nodded. He respected the code, some identities were meant to stay buried. She clutched the combat boots in her lap and filled out intake forms for PTSD treatment, her hands trembling as she listed her symptoms. Sleep disruption. Hypervigilance. Intrusive memories of combat operations. Difficulty maintaining civilian employment. The form asked about her previous occupation. Rachel stared at the line for a long moment. Then she wrote, nursing. It was the only answer that wouldn't require explanation. The clinic door opened at 3:02 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, and General James Castellano walked in carrying his son like he was carrying his own heart outside his chest. Michael's small arms wrapped around his father's neck, and when the boy's eyes found Rachel restocking supplies in the back corner, his entire face transformed. Pale cheeks flushed. A smile broke across his mouth like sunrise through fog. Phantom, he whispered. Not loud. Like a prayer. Like a secret finally safe to speak aloud. Rachel's hand stilled mid-motion, a box of pediatric gauze frozen against her ribs. She turned. The general's eyes locked onto hers, and in that single moment, something shifted in the axis of the world. His chin trembled. His uniform, dress blues, medals catching the fluorescent light, seemed to straighten as if the man inside it was remembering how to stand. Senior Chief Petty Officer Torres, he said. His voice cracked on her rank like he was reading scripture. I have your file here. I need to read it to you. I need you to hear what you've done. The clinic around them seemed to pause. A nurse checking blood pressure in Bay 3 stopped talking. The receptionist's fingers went still on the keyboard. General Castellano opened the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. When he spoke again, each word fell like a hammer strike. 2 Navy crosses. He paused. The silence held weight. For Purple Hearts. Another pause. Longer this time. His voice dropped lower, rougher. 18 commendations for Valor. 72 field promotions recommended. 214 lives documented saved during Operation Sandcastle, Sangin Valley, 2010 through 2013. Rachel didn't move. Her breathing was level, controlled, the same breathing she'd used in operating tents while rounds came in. But her eyes glistened. Just slightly. Just enough to show the trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The clinic door opened again. A Navy SEAL commander in civilian clothes entered, moving with the kind of precision that made the air pressure change. He was broad-shouldered and scarred, with eyes that had seen the same things Rachel's had seen. He walked straight to her. Senior Chief, he said, and his voice carried the weight of brotherhood earned in blood. I'm Commander Dale Mercer. Charlie Platoon, 2010. You pulled me out of a burning HMMWV near the Sangin market when we were supposed to be KIA. Picked me up off that hot asphalt with bullets still coming in and carried me 300 meters to the combat hospital you'd set up in that school. I was dead. You made me not dead. He stepped closer. She ran trauma response in that valley for 3 years. She did what no one else could do. She saved over 200 Marines, including my entire squad. And then she disappeared. That's ending today. The receptionist had her hand over her mouth. The nurse in Bay 3 was openly staring. Michael squeezed his father's shoulders tighter, his eyes never leaving Rachel's face. The clinic door opened a third time, and a woman in a federal windbreaker entered, FBI, the letters crisp and official across her chest. Her name tag read Special Agent Delia Cross. She carried herself like someone who had spent her career untangling what powerful men had buried. Rachel Torres, she said, and those words were an introduction and an absolution combined. Your gag order has been lifted by federal order. The classified operation known as Operation Sandcastle is no longer classified from your perspective. The officers who ordered your erasure from the record are now under federal investigation. We need your testimony. We need what you know. We need you to speak, and we can finally prosecute them. Rachel closed her eyes for one breath. Just one. When she opened them again, the clinic door was opening for the fourth time, and Dr. Sterling walked in with his phone to his ear, already smiling like a man who'd come to watch something burn. His smile lasted exactly 2 seconds. A Marine colonel in dress blue stepped directly into his path, blocking the doorway. Behind him, visible through the clinic windows, a news van was parking. Cameras were being unloaded. This was not an accident. This was orchestration. Dr. Nathan Sterling, the colonel said, and his voice was the sound of judgment handed down. By order of the United States Marine Corps and the Hospital Board of Oak Creek Memorial, your clinical privileges are hereby revoked, effective immediately and permanently. You are removed from active practice pending federal investigation into pharmaceutical fraud, deliberate obstruction of patient care, and conspiracy to commit fraud totaling $247,000. Sterling's phone dropped to the floor. His face went the color of hospital sheets. That's not all, the colonel continued, and news cameras pressed against the clinic windows, recording every frame. The woman you attempted to silence, Senior Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, saved your patient's life. Performed an emergency needle decompression in 40 seconds when you were too busy protecting your profit margins to recognize a tension pneumothorax. She did it with one hand and muscle memory, and then you had her arrested for it. The colonel stepped aside. You're done here, Dr. Sterling. Go home. Call your lawyer. Start preparing for federal court. Sterling moved like a man sleepwalking, backing toward the door. The news cameras followed him. His face was filmed from every angle. By that evening, the footage would be on every local news station in Georgia. By morning, it would be national. Medical ethics courses across the country would play it while instructors asked students, what did he miss? What should have stopped him sooner? Michael whispered something to his father. The general bent down, and his son's small hand reached out and squeezed Rachel's palm. The touch was feather-light, electric. Thank you, Phantom, the boy said. For the boots. Rachel didn't cry. She wouldn't cry. But when she squeezed his hand back, her touch was the gentlest thing in the room. 6 months later, Rachel stood in a ballroom at the Pentagon in her Navy dress uniform, pressed and perfect, medals arranged on her chest like proof that she'd been real the whole time. Navy crosses first. Then Purple Hearts. Then the smaller decorations that told the story of 3 years in a valley where the temperature reached 112 degrees and the mortality rate for untreated trauma was measured in minutes. General Castellano stood beside her, reading her citation for the ceremony that formally restored her service record and returned her name to the rosters that had erased her. Michael stood in a miniature Marine dress uniform his father had commissioned specially. He held Rachel's hand the way he'd held it in the clinic, small fingers wrapped around steadiness. His health had transformed in 6 months under a treatment protocol Rachel had designed, chelation therapy for chronic organophosphate exposure, not the degenerative nerve disease every specialist had assured his family was his curse. The poison that had been slowly stealing him was being pulled from his body one clean infusion at a time. He walked without a limp now. He climbed stairs. He ran. The ceremony concluded with applause that echoed like thunder off stone. 2 weeks later, Rachel returned to Savannah, to Oak Creek Memorial, where the board appointed her chief of pediatric emergency medicine. Her office overlooked the pediatric floor. On the wall behind her desk hung a shadow box, glass-fronted and carefully maintained. Inside were combat boots, leather cracked and faded from desert heat, soles worn thin by 1,000 hours of running between the dying and the barely alive. A small brass plaque read, El Corporal Marcos Santos, Sangin Valley, 2012. She never forgot the Marine who wore them before her, the boy who'd lost both feet to an IED, who'd refused morphine so he could stay awake to give her his boots when she'd given him her only dry socks. He'd made it home. He was teaching now. Graphic design. He had 2 kids. He'd sent her a photo once. Her first day in the new role, Rachel gathered her staff in the pediatric bay, every nurse, every resident, every med tech who had watched Sterling throw that chart at her feet, who had heard him say she'd be gone within a week. "We have one rule here," she said. Her voice carried differently now, with the kind of authority that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "We treat every patient like they're the most important person in the world. Because to someone, they are. We move like we're running into a burning building. We work like we're holding someone's child in our hands. Because we are." That evening, someone slipped a handwritten note under her office door. The envelope was unsigned. Inside, in careful script, "Thank you for showing us what real medicine looks like." The note was from one of the residents who'd laughed at Sterling's bet. Rachel kept it in her desk drawer beside her military challenge coin. 300 miles south, in a strip mall outside the city limits, Dr. Sterling stood in front of a CPR certification class, teaching chest compressions to bored nursing students who scrolled their phones between practice rounds on plastic dummies. The fluorescent lights hummed their eternal hum. Behind him on the wall hung a framed quote in Times New Roman font, "True class is what you do when the lights go out." He never looked at it. If you've made it this far, you know what real strength looks like. It's quiet, it's patient, and it's often wearing scrubs instead of stars. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes no one thought to notice. Share this with someone who's been underestimated. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been judged for who you appeared to be instead of who you actually were?